2 broken souls, 1 magical trap, and a command impossible to obey. Just wait. When the walls breathe your fear, will your enemy become your only breath or the final drop of your blood? This story is unfolding right now. The silence of the castle's west wing was not peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, like a wool blanket soaked in freezing water. It was the kind of silence that had mass, pressing against the eardrums, broken only by the rhythmic, deliberate scrape of a dragon-hide boot against stone and the lighter, quicker tap of a heel. Hermione Granger adjusted her grip on the heavy stack of parchment in her arms, her knuckles white. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel him behind her, a presence as sharp and cold as a draft in winter. Draco Malfoy. They had been assigned this restoration project by Headmistress McGonagall, cataloguing the sealed archives of the Astronomy Tower's lower levels. It was a punishment disguised as a privilege, or perhaps a trust exercise disguised as torture. Hermione hadn't decided which yet. "If you sigh one more time, Granger," Malfoy's voice cut through the stagnant air, low and dragging, "I'm going to hex you. Probation be damned." Hermione stopped abruptly. The dust motes dancing in the shaft of pale afternoon light seemed to freeze. She turned slowly, clutching the parchments like a shield. Draco stood 10 paces back, leaning against a tapestry depicting a hunt that had long since faded into grey smudges. He looked immaculate and exhausted all at once. His black robes were tailored to perfection, but the shadows under his eyes were bruised, violent things against his pale skin. He looked like a porcelain doll that had been dropped and glued back together, whole, but waiting to shatter again. "If you actually did some work instead of radiating aristocratic disdain," Hermione snapped, her voice echoing too loudly in the narrow corridor, "I wouldn't have to sigh." "I am working," he drawled, pushing himself off the wall. He walked past her, creating a breeze that smelled of expensive soap and old parchment. "I'm supervising. It's what Malfoys do best. You're insufferable. And you're predictable. A boring trait, really." He didn't look at her. He never looked at her. Not really. For the past 3 weeks, he had looked at her shoulder, her ear, the space above her head. It was as if acknowledging her eyes would make her real, and if she were real, then his guilt would have a target. They reached the end of the corridor. A heavy oak door, bound in iron straps that looked like ribs, stood before them. It wasn't on the map. Hermione felt a prickle of magic wash over her skin, static electricity mixed with the taste of copper. "This is it," she whispered, the annoyance fading into professional curiosity. "The Solarium Archive. It hasn't been opened since the mid-19th century." Draco shifted beside her. For a fleeting second, the mask of boredom slipped, revealing a flicker of genuine unease. His hand twitched toward his wand, then fell back to his side. "It feels wrong," he muttered. "It's just old magic, Malfoy. Don't tell me you're afraid of dust." "There is dust, Granger, and then there is decay. This smells like something died in here, and the castle forgot to bury it." Hermione ignored him, though a cold shiver traced her spine. She stepped forward, raising her wand. "Alohomora." Nothing happened. The heavy iron bands didn't groan. The lock didn't click. Instead, the air around the door seemed to ripple, like heat haze on asphalt. "Pathetic," Draco sneered. He stepped up, his shoulder brushing hers. The contact was electric, jarring. He recoiled instantly, as if burned, and she took a sharp step back, clutching her arm. For a second, they stared at each other, shocked by the violence of such a simple touch. His grey eyes were wide, the pupils blown. "Watch it," he hissed, his voice trembling slightly. "You stepped into my space," she countered, breathless. "Just stand back." He raised his hawthorn wand, the wood dark against his pale fingers. He muttered a complex unlocking charm in Latin, a family spell she recognized from the darker texts in the library. The door groaned. It didn't swing open. It dissolved. The wood simply faded away into mist, revealing a circular room bathed in a strange twilight blue illumination. There were no windows. The light came from the walls themselves, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. "After you," Draco said, mocking chivalry, but he didn't lower his wand. Hermione stepped across the threshold. The air inside was cooler, crisp, and smelled of ozone and burning sugar. The room was empty, save for a single low stone table in the center and shelves lining the walls, completely bare of books. "It's empty," Hermione said, disappointment leaking into her voice. McGonagall said there were records. Draco followed her in, his eyes scanning the ceiling. "It's not empty, it's hungry." "What?" "The geometry," he said, gesturing vaguely with his wand. "Look at the floor. It's not flat. It slopes imperceptibly toward the center, and the runes on the lintel. That's not standard containment." He turned to leave, panic suddenly sharpening his features. "Granger, get out! Now!" "Wait, I need to document." "I said move!" He lunged for her, grabbing her wrist. The moment his skin touched hers, the room slammed shut. There was no sound of a door closing. The archway they had entered through simply ceased to exist. Where the open corridor had been, solid stone wall now stood, seamless and ancient. Hermione gasped, yanking her wrist from his grip. "What did you do?" "Me?" Draco laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "You're the one who waltzed in here like you own the place. I told you to leave. You grabbed me. I was trying to save your neck, you ungrateful little—" "Save me? You?" Hermione felt the panic rising in her throat, hot and acrid. She spun around, pointing her wand at the wall where the door had been. "Bombarda!" The spell hit the stone and vanished. No explosion, no debris. The light in the walls pulsed faster, turning from a calm blue to a sickly, bruised purple. "Stop it!" Draco shouted, shielding his face. "You're feeding it!" "I'm trying to get us out," Hermione yelled back. Her composure, usually her strongest armor, was cracking. Being trapped, enclosed in stone, it triggered memories of the manor. She couldn't breathe. She needed air. She needed out. "Reducto! Confringo!" "Granger, stop!" Draco tackled her. It wasn't a romantic embrace. It was a desperate tackle. He drove her into the stone wall, pinning her arms to her sides. His body was hard, tense, shaking with adrenaline. "Look!" he roared, forcing her to look at the room. The purple light was throbbing now, angry and violent. The air pressure had dropped so low her ears popped. A high-pitched whining sound, like a scream trapped in glass, filled the room. "It absorbs magic," Draco whispered, his face inches from hers. She could feel his erratic breath on her cheek. "Aggressive magic. It absorbs it and seals the room tighter. You are burying us alive." Hermione stared at him, her chest heaving. His eyes were storm grey, filled with a terror he was desperately trying to suppress. He wasn't sneering now. He was terrified. She went limp against the wall. "Okay," she whispered. Okay, let me go. Draco released her slowly, backing away as if she were a bomb. He ran a hand through his platinum hair, messing up the perfect style. My father, he spoke of rooms like this, old interrogation chambers, or training grounds. The Drakosis anomaly. Drakosis. Hermione's mind raced, latching onto the theory to escape the fear. I've read about them. Theoretical constructs. They react to emotional volatility. They eat it, Draco corrected grimly. He paced the small room like a caged tiger. They feed on magical dissonance. Anger, fear, panic. It's all fuel. If we fight, the walls get thicker. If we cast spells, the air runs out. Hermione slid down the wall until she hit the floor. She pulled her knees to her chest. So we're trapped. Brilliant deduction, Granger. 10 points to Gryffindor. Stop it. Stop what? Being right? Stop being you, she snapped, glaring up at him. We are stuck in a magical anomaly that feeds on conflict, and you're picking a fight. Do you want to die here, Malfoy? Because I certainly don't plan on dying with you. Draco stopped pacing. He looked down at her, his expression twisting into a sneer that didn't quite reach his eyes. Believe me, the feeling is mutual. If I die here, my ghost will be thoroughly annoyed. He sat down on the other side of the room, as far away from her as possible, leaning his head back against the stone. The room was roughly 15 feet wide. Not enough space. Not nearly enough space for the history that lay between them. The silence returned, but now it was different. It wasn't the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a held breath. The purple light in the walls faded slightly, returning to a wary indigo. Hermione watched him. He had closed his eyes, his hands resting on his knees. His fingers were trembling. She realized with a start that he was reciting something under his breath. Occlumency. He was building his walls. She felt a wave of irrational anger. He could just shut it off. He could just retreat into his mind and leave her here, alone in the panic. It's not going to work, she said softly. Draco's eyes snapped open. What? Occlumency. You can't hide from this. The room. It senses the magic in your blood, not just your thoughts. Repressing it is just another form of tension. And I suppose you have a better plan, he spat. Shall we braid each other's hair, sing campfire songs? We have to be calm, truly calm. I am calm. You are vibrating, Malfoy. He glared at her, but he didn't argue. He knew she was right. The air was getting thin again. So, he said, his voice hollow. We wait. We wait, Hermione agreed, until the room believes we aren't a threat. Or until we starve. Let's focus on the first hour. They sat in silence for a long time. The stone was cold beneath Hermione's legs. She looked at Draco, really looked at him. The arrogant tilt of his chin was gone, replaced by a weary set of his jaw. He looked young. Too young to have the dark mark etched into his skin. Too young to have that haunted look in his eyes. She hated him. She reminded herself of that. She hated him for the bullying, for the slurs, for the manner. She hated him for standing by while Bellatrix tortured her. But as she watched the soft, pulsing light of the room cast shadows across his face, she felt something else beneath the hate. A heavy, dull ache. They were two soldiers left over from a war that had ended, trapped in a box that wanted to eat their trauma. Draco turned his head, catching her staring. He didn't look away this time. His gaze was intense, searching. "What are you thinking, Granger?" he asked quietly. The venom was gone, replaced by exhaustion. "I'm thinking," she whispered, "that this is going to be the longest night of our lives." The light in the walls flickered, turning a soft, tentative blue. The room seemed to exhale. They were safe for the moment. But the air between them was electric, charged with everything they weren't saying. Draco closed his eye again. "Don't get comfortable, Granger. As soon as this door opens, we go back to pretending you don't exist." "Agreed," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. The first hour passed, then the second. The cold began to seep into their bones, and in the silence, the sound of Draco's breathing and the beating of her own heart became the only things in the world. The trap was set. The game had begun, and the only way to win was to surrender, not to the room, but to the terrifying reality of being alone with the enemy. The blue light of the Drakosis chamber did not mimic the sun. It was a stagnant, underwater glow that made time feel like a physical weight. Every breath Hermione took felt recycled, tasting of ancient dust and the sharp metallic tang of Draco's restrained magic. She had tried to count the seconds to maintain her grip on reality, but the rhythm of the pulsing walls eventually dizzied her, forcing her to close her eyes. When she opened them again, the temperature had plummeted. A thin sheen of frost began to creep across the stone floor, tracing the jagged lines of the floor's sloping geometry. Hermione shivered, her teeth chattering before she could suppress the sound. Across the room, Draco looked like a statue carved from ice. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, his breath blooming in pale, ghostly clouds in front of his face. He looked regal even in his terror, a prince of a fallen kingdom, refusing to acknowledge the cold that was slowly turning his fingers blue. "Malfoy," she whispered. The words seemed to hang in the air, refusing to dissipate. He didn't move. "Don't, Granger. The room. It's changing. It's freezing us." "I noticed," he snapped, though the bite in his voice was muffled by the cold. "It's the second phase. The weight. It tests the endurance of the body once it has exhausted the volatility of the mind. It wants to see if we'll break or if we'll seek warmth." Hermione hugged her arms tighter. "Seek warmth? From where? There's nothing here but stone." Draco finally looked at her. His grey eyes were piercing, filled with a sudden, sharp clarity that made her stomach flip. "From each other, obviously. The anomaly is a cruel mirror. It knows we despise the thought of proximity. Therefore, it makes proximity the only price for survival." He looked away again, his jaw tight. "I'd rather freeze." "Don't be a martyr, Draco. It doesn't suit you," Hermione said, her voice trembling. "If we catch hypothermia, our magic will fluctuate. If our magic fluctuates, the room will react. We'll be crushed before we even have the chance to freeze." She watched the frost crawl closer to the hem of her robes. It was beautiful in a lethal way, crystalline patterns that looked like reaching fingers. She thought of her parents, of the warm sun in Australia that she had only recently restored to their memories. She thought of Harry and Ron, likely sitting in the Great Hall right now, wondering why she hadn't shown up for dinner. The thought of dying here, in a nameless hole with a man who couldn't even look her in the eye, sparked a flare of indignant heat in her chest. "Move," she commanded. Draco blinked, startled. "What?" "Move over, or I'm moving to you. I don't care about your pure-blood sensibilities or your aristocratic disdain. I am cold. I am tired. And I am not dying because you're too proud to share a square meter of floor." She didn't wait for his permission. She scrambled across the stone, her movements clumsy as the cold began to numb her joints. She stopped a foot away from him. Even at this distance, she could feel the faint radiation of heat from his body. Draco watched her with the wariness of a cornered animal. "If you touch me, Granger, I won't be held responsible for my reaction." "Your reaction to what?" "Basic thermodynamics," she countered, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Slowly, tentatively, she sat down beside him. She didn't touch him yet, but the gap between them was narrow, a sliver of shadowed air. The room responded instantly. The frost stopped its advance. The indigo light softened, shifting toward a violet grey. "See," she whispered. Draco let out a long, shaky breath. "Dreadful. This is absolutely dreadful." For a long time they sat in that narrow margin of space. Hermione could hear the rustle of his silk-lined robes every time he moved. She could smell the scent of him more clearly now. Sandalwood and a hint of something bitter, like crushed herbs. It was a scent she had associated with Malfoy Manor, with the drawing-room floor, with pain. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting back the sudden surge of nausea. Approach. Repulsion. The seesaw was in full motion. "You're shaking," Draco said. It wasn't an observation of pity. It was a statement of fact, cold and detached. "I'm fine." "You're not. You're vibrating the floorboards." He sighed, a sound of profound irritation, and then, before she could protest, he reached out. His hand closed around her upper arm, pulling her toward him. Hermione gasped, her breath catching in her throat. He didn't embrace her. He simply anchored her against his side, his shoulder acting as a brace for hers. The contact was a shock to the system. He was warm, unbearably so. His body was a furnace compared to the stone. Hermione stiffened, every muscle in her body screaming to pull away, to flee from the personification of her nightmares. But as the heat began to seep through her layers of wool, the physical relief began to override the psychological fear. She leaned into him, just a fraction. "Don't make a thing of it," he muttered, his voice vibrating through his chest against her shoulder. "I wouldn't dream of it," she replied, her voice small. Silence reclaimed the room, but it was no longer the silence of two strangers. It was the silence of two survivors holding onto a sinking ship. Hermione looked down at her hands, which were resting in her lap. Draco's hand remained on her arm, his grip firm but not crushing. She could feel the individual pressure of his fingers. She began to wonder about the internal monologue behind those grey eyes. Was he disgusted? Was he as terrified as she was? He had spent years calling her names that meant she was less than. Now, her life force was the only thing keeping him from the void. "Why did you come back?" she asked suddenly. The question had been rotting in her mind since the start of term. "To Hogwarts. You could have gone abroad. You could have stayed at the manor and rotted in your gold." Draco didn't answer for so long. She thought he had fallen into an occlumency trance. Then he spoke, his voice so low she almost missed it. "The manor isn't a home, Granger. It's a tomb. Every time I walk down a hallway, I hear things. I see things. Coming back here was the only way to prove to myself that the world didn't actually end in May." He paused, his grip on her arm tightening almost imperceptibly. Though some days, I think it might have been easier if it had. The honesty was a blade, sharp and unexpected. It cut through Hermione's defenses, laving her raw. She had expected a sneer, a lie, a deflection. She hadn't expected the truth. "I hear them too," she admitted, her voice a mere thread of sound. "Bellatrix, the screaming. Sometimes I wake up and I can't feel my arm because I think the words are still being carved into it." She felt him flinch. The hand on her arm jumped, his fingers splaying out. For a second, she thought he would pull away, that the mention of his aunt's crimes would revive the wall between them. Instead, he moved his hand. He slid it down her arm over the sleeve of her jumper until his palm rested over her wrist, exactly where the scar was hidden. He didn't say anything. He didn't apologize. He just held her wrist, his thumb resting over her pulse point. The room glowed a warm, steady amber. The frost vanished entirely. The air became thick, not with cold, but with a tension so heavy it felt like it could be touched. Hermione turned her head slightly, looking at him. He was already looking at her. The distance between their faces was inches. She could see the fine lines around his eyes, the slight tremble of his lower lip. In this half-light, he didn't look like a villain. He looked like a boy who had been asked to carry the weight of a mountain and had been crushed by it. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then snapped back to her eyes. The repulsion returned, swift and violent. He let go of her wrist as if it were red-hot coal. "The room is warm now," he said, his voice returning to that icy aristocratic clip. "You can move back." The sudden withdrawal felt like being slapped. Hermione felt the cold rush back in, not from the room, but from him. The seesaw swung violently back to the other side. "Right," she said, her voice shaking with a mix of embarrassment and anger. "Of course." She moved away, putting the distance back between them. The amber light flickered, turning a muddy, uncertain orange. "You really can't help yourself, can you?" she snapped, her eyes stinging. "The moment things feel human, you have to ruin it." Draco leaned his head back against the wall, his eyes closed. "Humanity is a luxury we don't have right now, Granger. We have a goal. Survival. Everything else is just static." "Static," she whispered, leaning her head against the opposite wall. The silence returned, but the peace was gone. The room was watching them, feeding on the fresh spark of resentment and the underlying, terrifying current of attraction that neither of them was willing to name. As the hours stretched on, Hermione felt the weight of the weight beginning to crush her. She needed to know what was on the other side of that stone. She needed to know if Draco Malfoy was the monster she remembered, or the broken boy who had just held her pulse in his hand. She closed her eyes, but all she could see was the ghost of his thumb against her skin. They were no longer just waiting for the door to open. They were waiting for each other to break. The amber light of the Drakosis had curdled into a sickly, jaundiced yellow. Time was no longer a sequence of minutes, but a series of physiological betrayals. The cramping of muscles, the dryness of the throat, and the relentless, thrumming static of magic being siphoned away. Hermione pressed her back against the cold stone, trying to find a spot that didn't ache. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the blueprint of the room, the runes she couldn't decipher, and the pale, sharp profile of the man sitting 6 feet away. Draco hadn't moved in hours. He was a master of stillness, a skill learned, no doubt, in drawing rooms where a single flinch could mean a cruciatus. But the stillness was a lie. The room knew it. The air was becoming thick again, heavy and humid, like the moments before a summer thunderstorm. "It's getting harder to breathe," Hermione said. Her voice was raspy, a ghost of its usual clarity. Draco didn't open his eyes. "The room is tightening the seal. We're losing the equilibrium." "Because of you," she snapped, the frustration finally boiling over. "Because you're sitting there building a fortress inside your head. You're radiating enough static to power a lighthouse, Malfoy. You're terrified, and the room is eating it." His eyes snapped open, grey and stormy. "I am not terrified, Granger. I am bored. There's a difference." "Liar." She stood up, her legs wobbling. She paced the small radius of the room, her robes sweeping against the stone. "You're terrified that if you let your guard down for 1 second, I'll see something you don't want me to see. Or worse, you'll feel something you can't control. That's what this is about, isn't it? The Malfoy pride. You'd rather suffocate in a vacuum than admit you're human." Draco stood up slowly, his movements predatory and graceful despite the fatigue. He stepped into her path, forcing her to stop. "You think you know everything because you've read a few books and won a war. You think you can diagnose me like a specimen under a glass? I don't need a textbook to see a man who's drowning," she whispered, looking up at him. The tension was a physical cord stretched between them, humming with a frequency that made the very floor vibrate. The walls began to pulse in sync with their breathing, faster, brighter, a frantic violet that signaled impending collapse. "Stay away from my head, Granger," he hissed, leaning down until they were nose to nose. "And stay away from my humanity. It's not for you to scavenge." "Then stop feeding the room," she yelled, her hands balling into fists. "Stop making it a cage. I want to go home." The word home seemed to shatter something. The violet light flared into a blinding white, and a sudden, violent tremor shook the floor. Hermione lost her balance, stumbling forward. Draco reached out, catching her by the waist to steady her, but the movement was too fast, too jagged. A bolt of raw, chaotic magic, a discharge from the room itself, struck the center stone table and ricocheted. It hit Draco squarely in the chest. He didn't scream. He let out a choked, wet gasp and flew backward, his body slamming into the far wall. He slumped to the floor, his head lolling to the side. "Draco!" The name left her lips before she could think to call him Malfoy. She scrambled across the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room was screaming now, a high, piercing whistle that made her ears bleed. The white light was fading into a deep, bruised crimson. She reached him, and her breath hitched. His shirt was scorched, the fine linen blackened over his sternum. But it wasn't the burn that terrified her. It was the way his magic was reacting. It was leaking out of him in visible, silvery threads, being pulled toward the walls of the room. The Drakosis was feeding on his life force directly. "No, no, no," she whimpered, pulling him into her lap. His skin was clammy, his pulse erratic. "Draco, wake up. You have to ground yourself. Stop the leak." His eyes drifted open, but they were unfocused, glazed with a terrifying silver sheen. He looked at her, but he didn't see her. He was seeing something else. "Mother," he whispered, his voice cracking. I couldn't do it. The bird, it wouldn't sing. I'm sorry. Hermione's heart shattered. He was back in the 6th year, back in the room of requirement, breaking under the weight of an impossible task. She saw the raw, unvarnished agony of a child who had been forced to become a killer and failed at the cost of his soul. "It's okay," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. She took his hands in hers. They were ice cold. "The bird is gone, Draco. The war is over. You're safe." "Too much blood," he moaned, his head thrashing against her knees. "The floor. It's always so cold. Make it stop, please. Just make it stop." He clutched her hands, his grip so tight it bruised her bones. He was seeking an anchor in the storm of his own trauma. The room's red light began to soften, sensing the shift from conflict to care. The Drakosis was a predator, but it was also a teacher. It demanded truth. Hermione realized then that she couldn't just wait. She had to participate. She leaned down, pressing her forehead against his. It was an act of profound intimacy, a blurring of boundaries she would have found unthinkable hours ago. "Listen to my voice," she commanded, her voice thick with emotion. "Focus on the sound. Focus on the heat. I am here. Hermione is here. You are not alone in the dark." Draco's breathing hitched. The silver light in his eyes began to recede, replaced by the familiar, piercing grey. He blinked, the fog of the past clearing as he focused on the woman holding him. He saw her tears. He felt the warmth of her breath on his lips. For a moment, the masks were gone. There was no mudblood, no Death Eater, no war. There were only two hearts beating in a stone box. Draco's hand travelled upward, his fingers trembling as they brushed the hair away from her face. His touch was hesitant, as if he expected her to vanish or turn into a nightmare. He traced the line of her jaw, his thumb lingering near the corner of her mouth. "Why?" he breathed, the word laden with 1,000 unspoken questions. Why save him? Why care? Why cry for the boy who had hated her? "Because I know what it's like to be broken," she whispered. "And because you aren't the monster you pretend to be." His expression crumpled. It was a fleeting thing, a shadow of grief and relief that crossed his face before the walls went back up. He pulled his hand away, a look of profound shame crossing his features. He tried to sit up, but the movement caused him to hiss in pain, his hand flying to his scorched chest. "Don't move," she cautioned, pressing a hand to his shoulder. "The room drained a lot of your magic. You're weak." "I don't need your pity, Granger," he spat, but the venom was gone. It sounded like a reflex, a script he was forced to read. "It's not pity, it's a fact." She looked around. The room was now a steady, calm violet. The weight had resumed, but the rules had changed. The air was breathable again, but the silence was now charged with the memory of his touch. Draco leaned his head against the wall, closing his eyes. He looked fragile, his usual arrogance stripped away by the magical backlash. "You saw," he said quietly. "I saw. You won't tell them. Potter, Weasley." "Of course not." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "The great Hermione Granger, keeping secrets for a Malfoy. My ancestors must be spinning in their vaults." "Let them spin," she said, sitting back but remaining close enough that their knees touched. The silence stretched on, but the seesaw had tipped into a dangerous new territory. The repulsion was fading, replaced by a terrifying magnetic pull. She looked at his hands, pale, scarred, and surprisingly elegant, and felt a sudden, irrational urge to take them again. The room began to grow colder once more. The Drakosis wasn't finished with them. The cycle of warmth and cold was accelerating, demanding more than just physical proximity. It was demanding a total surrender of the soul. Draco's eyes opened, and he looked at her with a raw, desperate intensity. "I can't do this much longer, Hermione." Her name on his lips felt like a spell, more powerful than any she had ever cast. It was a plea and a warning all at once. "We have to," she said, though her voice wavered. "We have to just wait." "Wait for what?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "For the walls to break, or for us to." He reached out, his hand hovering inches from her cheek. The tension was so thick she could taste it, a mixture of salt, ozone, and desire. He was waiting for her to pull away. He was waiting for the rejection he felt he deserved. Hermione didn't move. She held his gaze, her heart thundering in her ears. The room began to glow a deep, hungry crimson. The final shift was approaching, and she realized with a jolt of terror that the game of survival was no longer about escaping the room. It was about escaping each other. The crimson light did not fade. It deepened, turning the circular chamber into the interior of a beating heart. The air had grown heavy and sweet, like wilting lilies in a closed room. It was the scent of a trap, a sensory overload designed to break the last vestiges of logical resistance. Hermione felt the sweat pooling at the small of her back, her skin sensitized to the point of agony. Every time her robes brushed against her own legs, it felt like a jolt of static. Draco's hand was still hovering near her face, his fingers trembling. The shame that had clouded his features moments ago was being burned away by a different, more primal struggle. He looked at her, not as a classmate, nor as an enemy, but as the only solid thing in a dissolving world. "You're doing it again," he whispered, his voice a jagged rasp. "Doing what?" Hermione's voice was barely a breath. "Invading," he said. He didn't pull his hand away. Instead, he allowed his fingertips to finally graze the curve of her cheek. His skin was fever hot now, the exact opposite of the ice that had nearly claimed them earlier. "You occupy every corner of this room. I close my eyes and I hear your pulse. I breathe and I taste your magic. It's disgusting how much space you take up." The words were harsh, but his touch was devastatingly gentle. He traced the line of her cheekbone down to the corner of her jaw, his thumb dragging across the sensitive skin just below her ear. Hermione's breath hitched, a soft, involuntary sound that seemed to echo off the vibrating walls. "And you," she whispered, her courage flickering like a candle in a gale. "You're trying so hard to be invisible. But you're the loudest thing in here, Draco. Your silence is screaming." He let out a sharp, pained exhale and closed the distance. He didn't kiss her, not yet, but he pressed his forehead against hers again, his eyes squeezed shut. "I hate this," he choked out. "I hate that the only person who sees me is you. I hate that I want you to keep looking." This was the trust to betrayal/doubt swing of the seesaw. Hermione felt a surge of warmth, a profound desire to wrap her arms around him and pull him into the light, but it was immediately followed by a cold splash of reality. This was the Drakosis talking. This was the result of a magical anomaly, stripping away their inhibitions to feed on the resulting energy. Was any of this real? Or were they just two victims being manipulated into a state of artificial intimacy? She placed her hands on his chest, intending to push him back. But the moment her palms met the scorched linen of his shirt, her resolve vanished. She could feel his heart thundering against his ribs, a frantic, terrified rhythm. He wasn't a predator. He was a boy who was drowning, and she was the only thing he could reach. "Is this real?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Or is it just the room?" Draco pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. The grey was gone, replaced by a dark, fathomless charcoal. "Does it matter? In here, this is the only world that exists. If we die in an hour, does it matter if the feeling was real or just a product of the cage?" "It matters to me," she said, her Gryffindor stubbornness flaring up even through the haze. "I won't be a casualty of a magical experiment. I won't let my feelings be manufactured." Draco's expression hardened. The warmth vanished instantly, replaced by a biting, defensive cold. He dropped his hand and scrambled backward, putting a physical chasm between them once more. The room responded to the sudden spike in doubt. The crimson light flickered and died, plunged into a freezing starlit silver. "Spoken like a true scholar," he sneered, though the tremor in his hands betrayed him. "Always analyzing the spark instead of just feeling the fire. You're right, Granger. It's all fake. It's just chemistry and containment charms. My apologies for forgetting my place." The repulsion phase hit like a physical blow. Hermione shivered as the temperature dropped 30 degrees in a matter of seconds. The walls began to frost over again, but this time the ice was black, a jagged obsidian growth that seemed to absorb the light. "That's not what I meant," she cried, her voice cracking as she wrapped her arms around herself. "Isn't it?" Draco was back to his mask of aristocratic indifference, though his chest was still heaving from the exertion of his earlier collapse. "You're so afraid of being wrong that you'd rather freeze to death in a vacuum of your own logic. Well, congratulations. You're the smartest girl in a tomb." He turned away from her, staring at the black ice. The silence that followed was the most agonizing yet. It was a silence filled with the weight of things unsaid, and the crushing pressure of a bridge burned before it was even fully built. Hermione felt a tear escape and track a hot, stinging path down her cheek. She wasn't just cold, she was hollow. The connection they had shared, the raw, bleeding honesty of the sixth-year memories, felt like a dream that was rapidly turning into a nightmare. She looked at his back, at the sharp line of his shoulders, and felt a wave of profound regret. She had doubted him when he was most vulnerable, and in doing so, she had proved his own worst fears, that he was a monster, and that no one could ever truly care for what was underneath the mark on his arm. "Draco," she whispered. "Don't," he snapped. "Just wait, Granger. That's the rule, isn't it? Just wait for the end." The room grew darker. The black ice began to groan, the sound like breaking bones. The anomaly was losing patience. It had seen their potential for unity and had watched them tear it apart. Now it was moving to the final, most dangerous phase of the Drakosis, the consumption. The floor began to tilt more aggressively. The center stone table started to glow with a dark, gravitational pull. Hermione felt herself sliding toward it, her boots losing their grip on the frosted stone. "Draco! The floor!" He turned, his eyes widening as he saw the center of the room beginning to collapse into a swirling vortex of shadow and magic. He lunged for a protrusion in the wall, anchoring himself, but Hermione was further away. She slid toward the center, her fingernails clawing at the stone, leaving bloody trails in the frost. "Grab my hand!" Draco shouted, stretching his arm out across the gap. She reached for him, her fingertips inches from his, but the gravitational pull of the anomaly was too strong. The room was literally trying to swallow the dissonance she had created. "I can't!" she screamed, her legs dangling over the edge of the dark abyss that had opened in the center of the room. In that moment of absolute terror, the masks finally shattered for good. Draco didn't hesitate. He let go of his anchor on the wall and threw himself toward her, sliding into the danger. He caught her wrists, his grip like iron, his heels locking into a narrow groove in the stone. They hung there, suspended over a void of pure, chaotic energy. "Look at me," Draco commanded, his face inches from hers, his voice strained to the breaking point. "Look at me, Hermione. Don't look at the dark." She looked up, her eyes wide and wet. In his face, she saw everything. The fear, the guilt, the desperate, unyielding need for her to live. There was no doubt left. No one would risk this for a manufacture of the room. "I trust you," she sobbed. "Then give me your magic," he said, his eyes burning with a sudden, fierce light. "Stop holding it back. Stop protecting yourself from me. Give it to me and we'll push back." It was the ultimate vulnerability. To open one's magical core to another was a level of intimacy that surpassed even the most physical of acts. It was a merging of souls. Hermione took a shuddering breath and let the walls down. She stopped fighting the pull of his presence and leaned into it, mentally throwing open the doors to her magic. The reaction was instantaneous. A pillar of white-hot light erupted from where their hands met. It wasn't the room's light, it was theirs. The black ice shattered. The void in the floor slammed shut with a sound like thunder. They were thrown backward by the force of the magical equalization, sliding across the floor until they hit the far wall, tangled in a heap of limbs and gasping breaths. The room felt silent. The light returned to a soft, hesitant gold, the color of a summer dawn. They lay there for a long time, their bodies intertwined. Hermione's head was on his chest. His arms were wrapped around her, as if he would never let her go. The seesaw had stopped. The equilibrium had been reached. But the price of that equilibrium was a truth that neither of them could ever take back. Draco shifted, his breath fluttering against her hair. He didn't pull away. He tightened his hold, his face buried in the crook of her neck. "Now," he whispered, his voice trembling with an emotion she couldn't name. "Now we really have to wait, because if we leave this room, I don't know how to be the man who just did that." Hermione reached up, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. "We don't go back, Draco. We just go forward." The room glowed, steady and bright, but the door remained sealed. The final lesson of the Drakosis was yet to come. The golden light was deceptive. It felt like warmth, like safety, but it was the heavy, breathless calm of an altar before a sacrifice. They remained on the floor, a tangle of black robes and messy curls, their heartbeats finally beginning to slow into a singular, synchronized rhythm. For the first time since the door had dissolved, the silence wasn't a weapon. It was a shroud. Hermione shifted her weight, her cheek sliding against the scorched linen of Draco's shirt. She could feel the heat of his skin, a feverish, living warmth that grounded her more than the stone floor ever could. He didn't move to push her away. His hand, once so hesitant, now rested firmly at the small of her back. His fingers curled into the fabric of her jumper as if he were anchoring himself to the earth. "You're thinking too loud again," he murmured. His voice was no longer a blade. It was a low vibration that she felt in her own chest. "I'm trying to understand," she whispered back, refusing to move. "The magical output. It shouldn't have been that strong. 2 7th-year students shouldn't be able to collapse a Drakosis void." Draco let out a dry, hollow laugh that hitched in his throat. "Still the librarian. We didn't collapse it with power, Hermione. We collapsed it with symmetry. The room isn't looking for the strongest wizard. It's looking for the most honest connection. It's a primitive, disgusting piece of magic that demands the one thing no wizard wants to give." "Truth," she breathed. "Exposure," he corrected. He pulled back slightly, forcing her to look at him. His face was a map of exhaustion. The sharp, aristocratic lines of his features seemed softened by the amber glow, making him look devastatingly human. There was a smudge of soot on his cheek and a thin cut along his hairline, but it was his eyes that caught her. They were no longer the cold grey of a winter sky. They were molten, silver and raw, stripped of every defense he had spent a lifetime building. "I've spent 7 years hating you because it was easier than wondering why I couldn't stop looking at you," he said, the admission coming out like a confession under veritaserum. "I hated your blood, your parents, your books, because they were the walls that kept me safe from the fact that you were the only person in this castle who actually mattered." The emotional seesaw swung violently toward warmth. Hermione felt a lump form in her throat, a physical ache that made it hard to swallow. This was the betrayal of his own upbringing, the final crumbling of the Malfoy legacy. And yet, as she looked at him, the doubt crept in like a shadow. "Is that why you let her do it?" she asked, the words out of her mouth before she could stop them. "In the manor. Is that why you stood there and watched?" The hand on her back flinched. The silver in his eyes clouded instantly, turning back to lead. The repulsion was instantaneous. Draco pulled his hand away and sat up, his spine going rigid. The golden light in the room flickered, a streak of cold, sickly green lancing through the amber. "There it is," he said, his voice turning brittle. "The Gryffindor justice. You want me to bleed for it, don't you? You want me to admit I'm a coward so you can feel superior in your forgiveness." "No, Draco, I was 16, he roared, standing up abruptly. He paced the small circle of the room, his shadow dancing like a monstrous thing against the pulsing walls. "I was 16, and there was a madman in my dining room, and my mother was trembling beside me. I didn't watch because I wanted to see you suffer. I watched because I was paralyzed by the knowledge that if I moved, if I breathed, we would both be dead." He stopped, his back to her, his shoulders shaking. "I see it every night. Every time I close my eyes, I hear you. Do you think I don't know what I am? I am the boy who did nothing. And you are the girl who survived everything. We aren't symmetrical, Hermione. We're a tragedy." The room responded to his self-loathing. The temperature began to drop again, a biting wind whipping through the enclosed space, smelling of ozone and wet earth. The cold returned, not as ice on the floor, but as a vacuum in the air. Hermione stood up, her legs trembling. She didn't approach him this time. She stayed in the center of the room, her hands clenched at her sides. You think you're the only one with ghosts. You think I don't see the look on your face when you walk past the place where the Great Hall was rebuilt. You're not a tragedy, Draco. You're a survivor, just like me. But you're so addicted to your own guilt that you'd rather stay in this room and rot than step into the light and be forgiven. I don't want your forgiveness, he yelled, turning to face her. His eyes were wild. I want to be able to look at you without feeling like I'm burning alive. I want to be able to touch you without remembering the blood on the floor. He lunged forward, grabbing her by the shoulders. It wasn't a gentle movement. It was desperate, frantic. He shook her slightly, his face contorted with a mix of rage and agony. How can you even stand to be near me? How can you look at me and not see the mark? Because I see the boy who tried to save the bird in the cabinet, she screamed back, her tears finally overflowing. I see the boy who couldn't kill Dumbledore. I see you, Draco. Not your father, not your aunt, and not the Dark Lord. Just you. The room went silent. The wind died instantly. Draco froze, his fingers digging into the wool of her jumper. He stared at her, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps. The tension between them was no longer about the room or the magic or the war. It was about the terrifying precipice edge of the approach. He looked down at her mouth, his expression shifting from anger to a raw, starving hunger. Hermione didn't pull away. She leaned into him, her heart thumping against her ribs like a drum. She was emotionally vulnerable, her defenses shattered by the honesty of their exchange, but she had never felt more powerful. Just wait, he whispered, his voice trembling. The words were a plea now, not a rule. If I do this, if I touch you, there is no going back. I won't be able to be the cold, distant Malfoy you need me to be to stay safe. I don't want to be safe, she breathed, reaching up to cover his hands with her own. I want to be real. The room began to glow with a deep, pulsing violet. The emotional seesaw was vibrating at a frequency so high it felt like the stone was singing. Draco's gaze searched hers, looking for a reason to stop, for a spark of the old hatred to save them both. He found nothing but a mirror of his own longing. He groaned, a low, tortured sound, and slumped forward, burying his face in her hair. He didn't kiss her yet. He just held her, his body shaking with the force of his repressed emotions. He was morally grey, broken and restrained, but in the circle of her arms he was finally allowing the cracks to show. I'm so tired of waiting, he whispered into her neck. Then stop, she replied, her voice steady. But the Drakosis wasn't finished. Just as the warmth began to envelop them, a loud metallic clack echoed through the chamber. The stone table in the center began to sink into the floor, replaced by a pedestal holding a single, shimmering silver basin filled with a dark, swirling liquid. A pensive. The final lesson was not about their own truth, but the truth they were both hiding from. The room demanded a final sacrifice of a memory, the one memory they both feared most. Draco pulled back, his face pale. No. It's the only way out, Hermione said, her voice hollow. It wants the doubt. It wants the betrayal. It wants the moment we both gave up. The cold returned, but this time it was clinical. The room was no longer punishing them. It was waiting for the final piece of the puzzle. Draco looked at the basin, then at Hermione. The repulsion was back, but it was directed inward. If you see it, he whispered, you'll never look at me that way again. Try me, she challenged, though her heart was sinking. The chapter ended with the silver light of the pensive reflecting in their eyes, a cold, unforgiving mirror. The door remained invisible. The wait was over, but the game of survival had just entered its most lethal round. The silver fluid in the basin swirled with a predatory grace, casting flickering, ghostly shadows against the violet stone of the chamber. It was a cold light, the light of a moon reflecting off a frozen lake. Hermione felt a familiar dread pool in her stomach. She knew the weight of memories. She knew how they could be warped by guilt or polished by longing. But the Drakosis didn't want a polished memory. It wanted the raw, bleeding edge of the truth. Draco stood paralyzed, his hands clenched so tightly at his sides that his knuckles looked like polished bone. The emotional seesaw had swung back to a state of agonizing doubt. He looked at the basin as if it were a pool of acid. "It wants the moment," he said, his voice a brittle thread. The moment the lie became the truth. "Which lie, Draco?" Hermione stepped closer to the pedestal, her shadow lengthening across the floor. "We've told so many." "The lie that I didn't care," he hissed, finally turning to her. The raw vulnerability of their previous embrace had been replaced by a frantic, jagged energy. "The room knows, Hermione. It knows that in the middle of that war, in the middle of the blood and the fire, there was a moment I chose you, and it was the moment I doomed myself." He stepped toward the basin, his hand hovering over the silver surface. A single strand of silvery blue memory began to leak from his temple, drawn out by the room's insatiable hunger. "Don't look," he pleaded, his eyes wide and dark. "If you have any mercy left for me, Granger, look away." But the room wouldn't allow it. As the memory hit the liquid, the air in the chamber vanished, replaced by a sudden, jarring shift in atmosphere. They weren't in the solarium archive anymore. They were in the Great Hall, but it was a hall of nightmares. The ceiling was a churning mass of black smoke, and the smell of ozone and death was overwhelming. It was the Battle of Hogwarts. Hermione saw herself, younger, covered in dust and blood, her hair a wild, tangled mane. She was running toward the ruins of the marble staircase, Harry and Ron lost in the smoke behind her. But the memory didn't follow her. It stayed with the boy standing in the shadows of a crumbling archway. Draco. He looked like a ghost even then. He was holding his wand, but it was trembling so violently it was useless. A Death Eater, Thorfinn Roll, was levelling a curse at Hermione's back. She was distracted, looking for Harry, completely exposed. In the memory, Draco's face went through a transformation that made the real Draco, standing beside the basin, let out a choked sob. The boy in the memory didn't think. He didn't weigh the cost of his blood or the safety of his family. He raised his wand and cast a silent, shimmering shield between the curse and Hermione's back. The curse deflected, shattering a nearby stone gargoyle. Hermione had paused, glancing back at the noise, but the smoke had swallowed Draco before she could see him. But the memory didn't end there. Raoul had turned on Draco, his face contorted in fury. He had grabbed Draco by the throat, slamming him into the wall. "Whose side are you on, boy?" Raoul had snarled. And Draco, with the cold terror of a condemned man, had looked toward where Hermione had vanished and whispered, "Mine." The memory dissolved. The room slammed back into focus. The violet light, the stone walls, the heavy, suffocating silence. Hermione couldn't breathe. The approach was no longer a choice. It was an inevitability. She looked at Draco, who was leaning over the pedestal, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with the force of his shame. "You saved me," she whispered. "All this time. You let me believe I was alone in that moment." "I didn't save you for thanks," he spat, his voice muffled. "I saved you because I was weak, because I couldn't bear to see the world without you in it, even if you were the one destroying everything I was supposed to stand for. I betrayed my blood for a girl who didn't even know I was there." He looked up, and the repulsion in his eyes was heartbreaking. He was disgusted by his own nobility. He was a man who had lived a lie so long that the truth felt like a violation. "Now you know," he said, backing away from her. "I'm not a hero, Hermione. I'm a traitor to everyone, including myself. I'm a mess of contradictions that the Drakosis finally decided to gut." "You're not a traitor," she said, stepping toward him. Her heart was racing, the warmth of the revelation fighting through the cold of his self-loathing. "You're the man who chose a life over a cause. You chose me." "And look where it got us," he yelled, gesturing at the sealed walls. "Trapped in a game of survival. The room is feeding on this, don't you see? It's feeding on the fact that I love you and I hate myself for it." The word hung in the air like a physical object. Love. The emotional seesaw tipped into a terrifying vertical drop. The room responded with a flare of white-hot light that made the stone groan. The pressure was immense, the magical tension between them reaching a breaking point. Hermione didn't stop. She kept walking until she was inches from him. She could feel the static electricity jumping between their robes. The tension was so thick, it felt like moving through honey. "Say it again," she whispered. "No. Say it, Draco. Don't let the room have it. Give it to me." He looked at her, and for a second the mask of the morally grey aristocrat was gone. He looked like the boy in the smoke, terrified, lonely, and desperately in love. He reached out, his hand trembling as he cupped her face. His thumb brushed over her lower lip, his touch a mixture of reverence and despair. "I love you," he breathed, the words sounding like a curse and a prayer. "I've loved you since the 3rd year when you punched me, and I realized you were the only person brave enough to see me for what I really was. I love you, and it's the most miserable, wonderful thing I've ever known." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. The non-verbal intimacy of their shared breath, their shared history, was a weight that nearly brought them both to their knees. "But we can't," he whispered. "The world outside, it won't let us. My name, your reputation." "The world outside doesn't exist right now," she countered, her hands finding the lapels of his robes. "There is only this room. There is only the weight." The room began to glow a soft, shimmering gold once more, but this time the light was pulsing with a rhythmic, steady beat. The equilibrium was almost perfect. The trust was there, but it was being chased by the doubt of what would happen when the door finally opened. Draco's gaze was fixed on her mouth. The slow burn of the last several hours was reaching a flashpoint. He was emotionally broken on the inside, but in this moment he was looking to her for the pieces. "Hermione," he groaned, his voice a low, vibrating plea. He didn't wait for her to answer. He closed the distance, his lips hovering a hair's breadth from hers. The tension was unbearable, a physical ache in the center of her chest. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the scent of sandalwood and old books, and the sharp, metallic tang of his magic. Just as their lips were about to touch, the room gave a violent, final shudder. The silver basin on the pedestal shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. The door didn't open. Instead, the walls began to dissolve, not into the corridor, but into a void of pure white light. The wait was over, but the transition was violent. Draco's grip on her tightened, his arms wrapping around her with a possessive, desperate strength. "Don't let go!" he shouted over the rising roar of the magical collapse. "I won't!" she screamed back. As the light swallowed them, Hermione felt a sharp, sudden coldness, the final repulsion of the Drakosis. It was trying to tear them apart one last time, to see if their connection could survive the transition back to reality. She felt Draco's lips brush her temple, a ghost of a kiss in the middle of the storm. "I need to know," she thought, her mind a whirl of fear and longing. "I need to know what happens when the light fades." The feeling of, "I need to know what's next," was the only thing she had left as the world vanished into a blinding, silent white. The game was ending, but the real survival was about to begin. The white light was not the end. It was a transition, a blinding purgatory where the senses were stripped bare. Hermione felt the sensation of falling, though her feet remained anchored to a floor she could no longer see. The only thing that remained solid, the only thing that kept her from dissolving into the void, was the crushing grip of Draco's hands on her shoulders. She clung to him, her fingers digging into the expensive wool of his robes, her face buried against the heat of his neck. Then, with the suddenness of a snapped string, the light vanished. The air rushed back into her lungs, cold and smelling of damp stone and extinguished candles. Hermione gasped, her knees buckling. Draco caught her, his own breath coming in ragged, desperate hitches. They were back in the solarium archive, but it was no longer the pristine, pulsing chamber of the Drakosis. It was a ruin. The shelves were splintered, the floor was cracked, and the heavy iron-bound door hung open, swinging slightly on a single groaning hinge. Moonlight, real, pale, silvery moonlight, filtered through a high, narrow slit in the masonry. "We're out," Draco whispered. He didn't let go of her. He pulled her deeper into the shadows of the doorway, as if the castle itself were a predator waiting for them to move. His eyes were wide, scanning the darkness of the corridor. "We're back." The emotional seesaw gave a violent, nauseating lurch. The warmth of their shared confession in the white light was suddenly met with the cold of reality. Outside this room, the war was over, but the social lines were drawn in blood and ink. Hermione looked at Draco, his hair disheveled, his eyes raw with a vulnerability he would never show in the Great Hall. "Draco," she said, her voice trembling as she reached up to touch his face. He flinched. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but it felt like a slap. He didn't pull away completely, but his posture went rigid, the morally grey mask sliding back into place with terrifying speed. The repulsion had begun. He was looking at her, but he was seeing the Gryffindor princess, the war heroine, the girl who belonged to a world that would never accept him. "Don't," he muttered, his voice regaining its icy aristocratic edge. "Someone might see. Someone might see." Hermione's hand dropped to her side. The sting of the rejection was sharp, a bitter contrast to the man who had just told her he loved her in the dark. "We almost died in there, Draco. We shared everything. And your first thought is the social repercussions? My first thought is survival, Granger, he hissed, stepping back into the center of the ruined room. The moonlight caught the sharp angle of his jaw. In that room, the rules were different. In that room, I could afford to be a fool. But out here, my father is in Azkaban, my mother is under house arrest, and I am a pariah with a brand on my arm. If I so much as breathe in your direction, they'll say I'm using dark magic to confuse you. They'll ruin you just to get to me. Let them try, she said, her voice rising with a fierce, intelligent heat. I don't care about their opinions, Draco. I care about what happened in there. Was it a lie? Was the memory in the pensive just a trick of the Drakosis? Draco's expression crumpled for a fleeting second before he hardened it again. He looked at her with a mix of longing and profound, restrained guilt. It wasn't a lie. That's the problem. It's the truest thing I've ever felt, and it's the most dangerous. The tension between them was no longer the magical static of the chamber. It was the heavy, unspoken weight of their future. Hermione stepped forward, ignoring the coldness in his gaze. She was emotionally vulnerable, her heart still echoing with his confession, but she was also Hermione Granger. She did not back down from a fight, especially one for a soul. "You're a coward, Draco Malfoy," she whispered, her eyes burning with tears. "Not because you couldn't kill Dumbledore, and not because you were afraid of Voldemort. You're a coward because you're afraid of being happy. You'd rather hide in your guilt than take a chance on something real." "I am protecting you," he roared, his composure finally breaking. He lunged forward, grabbing her wrists, his face inches from hers. The approach was violent, fueled by a desperate need to make her understand. "You are the brightest witch of your age. You have a path laid out for you. Minister, scholar, whatever you want. I am a shadow. I am the thing that people whisper about in the hallways. If I touch you in the light, I'll pull you down into the dark with me. Do you think I could live with that? Do you think I could watch your light go out because of me? My light is mine to manage," she countered, her breath hitching as he held her wrists. "And maybe I'm tired of the light. Maybe it's too bright, too loud, and too demanding. Maybe I want the shadow." The silence that followed was thick with non-verbal intimacy. Draco's grip on her wrists softened, his thumbs beginning to trace slow, agonizing circles over her pulse points. He was emotionally broken, but in this moment, the "can't stand it" was losing the war to "can't help but think." The trust to betrayal/doubt cycle was spinning faster than ever. Hermione could see the conflict in the way his eyes searched hers. He wanted to push her away to save her, and he wanted to pull her so close they became one person. "We have to go," he whispered, though he didn't move. "They'll be looking for us. It's been hours." "Let them look." Hermione. Her name was a prayer on his lips, a broken sound that betrayed every wall he was trying to build. He let go of her wrists, but instead of backing away, he allowed his hands to travel upward, his fingers tangling in the messy, ash-streaked curls at the nape of her neck. He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the sound of their shared, erratic breathing. The room said to "just wait," he breathed. "I've been waiting my whole life for something that felt like this. And now that I have it, I'm terrified to move." "Then don't move," she whispered, her hands finding the small of his back, pulling him flush against her. "Just stay." But the castle was waking up. They could hear the distant, muffled sound of footsteps in the corridor below, the faint calling of names, McGonagall's voice, sharp and worried. The reality of the world was crashing in, demanding they return to their assigned roles. Draco pulled back, his eyes dark with a sudden, sharp clarity. "If we walk out that door together, there is no taking it back. The game of survival ends, and the real war begins. Are you sure, Hermione? Are you absolutely sure you want a monster like me by your side?" "You are not a monster," she said, her voice steady and sure. "You are just a man, and I am just a woman. And I think that's more than enough." The warmth to cold shift happened one last time as Draco straightened his robes, his face becoming a mask of aristocratic indifference. But he didn't look away from her. He reached out, his hand lingering for a fraction of a second over hers, a silent promise in the moonlight. "Wait for me," he whispered. In the great hall, "Don't look at me, don't speak to me, but wait. I've been waiting since the pensive, Draco. A few more hours won't kill me." He nodded, a sharp, jerky movement, and then he was gone, disappearing into the shadows of the corridor with the grace of a ghost. Hermione stood alone in the ruined room, the scent of him still clinging to her robes. The conflict of the room had been resolved, but the conflict of their lives was just beginning. She felt the heavy weight of the secret they now shared, a bond forged in a magical vacuum that was now being tested by the cold air of Hogwarts. She walked toward the door, her heart thumping a steady, defiant rhythm. The game of survival had taught her one thing. Survival wasn't about staying alive. It was about finding something worth living for. As she stepped into the corridor, she saw the first flickers of torchlight approaching. She straightened her spine, wiped the soot from her forehead, and prepared to play the part of the hero one last time. But deep inside, where the Drakosis had left its mark, she was already counting the seconds until she could see the silver in his eyes again. The chapter ended with the feeling of the calm before the storm, a tension so high it threatened to shatter the very stone of the castle. The great hall was a cathedral of light and noise, a jarring contrast to the suffocating indigo silence of the Drakosis. Hermione sat at the Gryffindor table, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood, her plate of food untouched. The air here smelled of roast beef, pumpkin juice, and the mundane chatter of students who had spent their afternoon in the sun, oblivious to the fact that two of their peers had nearly been erased from existence. Every laugh from Ron, every boisterous story from Seamus, felt like a distant echo. She was physically present, but her soul was still back in that ruined archive, vibrating at the frequency of Draco Malfoy's heartbeat. Across the hall at the far end of the Slytherin table, he sat. Draco was the picture of pure-blood composure. His hair was perfectly slicked back once more, his robes immaculate, his expression a mask of bored indifference as he stared into his goblet. To anyone else, he looked like the same cold, distant aristocrat he had always been. But Hermione saw the truth. She saw the way his fingers gripped the silver stem of his cup until his knuckles turned white. She saw the minute tension in his jaw, the way he breathed, slow, deliberate breaths that she recognized from their shared hours of waiting. The emotional seesaw was at its most agonizing peak. The repulsion of the public eye demanded they remain strangers. The approach of their shared trauma demanded they scream. Hermione felt a gaze on her. She looked up and caught his eyes. For a split second, the mask slipped. The grey went molten, filled with a raw, desperate longing that made her breath hitch. It was a silent conversation, a non-verbal scream of, "I'm still here. I haven't forgotten." Then, as quickly as it had appeared, he looked away, his face turning back to stone. "Hermione, you haven't heard a word I've said." Ron's voice broke the spell. He was looking at her with a mix of concern and confusion. "Are you sure you're all right? McGonagall said you and Malfoy got stuck in a localized time slip in the West Wing. Did he? Did he do something to you?" "No, Ron," she said, her voice sounding hollow to her own ears. "He didn't do anything. We just waited. It was a very long afternoon." "I bet. Being trapped with that ferret. I'd have lost my mind," Ron muttered, shaking his head. Hermione looked back at the Slytherin table, but Draco was gone. He had slipped out while Ron was talking, leaving his goblet half full. A spark of panic flared in her chest, the fear that the cold of the world had already started to freeze what they had built in the dark. She stood up abruptly. "I'm going to the library. I need to check something for the restoration project." "Again?" Harry asked, looking up from his pudding. "Hermione, you just got back." "I just need to finish a thought," she said, already moving toward the doors. She didn't go to the library. She followed the pull of the magic that still hummed in her blood, a residual connection to the man who had seen her soul. She climbed the stairs to the astronomy tower, her heart thumping against her ribs. The night air was crisp, the stars sharp and unforgiving above the crenellated walls. He was there, leaning against the stone parapet, staring out over the forbidden forest. He didn't turn when she approached, but his shoulders lost some of their rigidity. "I told you not to speak to me," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "You told me to wait. I waited. Dinner is over," she countered, stepping into the pool of moonlight beside him. Draco finally turned. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his eyes deeper in the natural night. "The world is already trying to pull us back into the scripts, Hermione. Your friends hate me. My house thinks I'm a blood traitor. There is no version of this that ends with a happily ever after. I'm not looking for a fairy tale, Draco. I'm looking for the man who shielded me in the Great Hall when no one was looking. I'm looking for the boy who held my hand while the room tried to eat us." She stepped closer, the tension returning, but this time it wasn't a cage. It was an invitation. She reached out, her fingers grazing the back of his hand where it rested on the stone. He didn't flinch this time. He turned his hand over, interlocking his fingers with hers, his grip almost painfully tight. "I can't be what they want me to be," he whispered, stepping into her space until their chests were inches apart. "And I can't let you be what you were before. I've ruined you, haven't I? I've tainted the hero." "You haven't ruined anything," she breathed, looking up into his storm-grey eyes. "You've just made it real." The trust was there, final and absolute. The doubt of the world outside still existed, but here, under the vast, uncaring stars, it felt small. The slow burn of the day, the hours of fear, the shared memories, the desperate proximity, finally reached its inevitable conclusion. Draco's gaze dropped to her mouth, his expression shifting from agony to a fierce, unyielding hunger. He cupped her face with both hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with a reverence that made her ache. "I have thought of nothing else since the light vanished," he confessed, his voice a low vibration against her lips. He leaned down, and this time there was no room to intervene, no magical anomaly to shatter the moment. His lips met hers in a kiss that was both a collision and a homecoming. It tasted of salt and desperation, of years of hidden glances and repressed longing. It was the warmth of the Drakosis made flesh. Hermione gasped into the kiss, her hands flying to his hair, pulling him closer, as if she could pull him into her very heart. He groaned, his kiss deepening, becoming more possessive, his tongue tracing the seam of her lips until she opened for him. It was a merging of two histories, two wars, and two broken people who had finally found the missing piece of their survival. When they finally broke apart for air, Draco didn't move away. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath hot and erratic against her skin. "I love you," he whispered, the words no longer a secret for a stone box, but a vow for the open air. "And I will fight every person in this castle to keep you." Hermione pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes bright with a fierce, intelligent joy. "Then we fight together." She pulled him back down for another kiss, this one slower, more certain. It was the resolution the room had demanded, the final shift from enemies to lovers, forged in a game where the only way to win was to lose oneself in the other. The castle stood silent around them, ancient and full of secrets. But the greatest secret was no longer hidden in the West Wing. It was here, in the shadow of the stars, where a lioness and a dragon had decided that the world could wait. The game was over, and for the first time in their lives, they were both truly alive. The transition from the magical suspension of the Drakosis back to the relentless machinery of Hogwarts felt like a physical sickness. For Hermione, the castle she once called home now felt like a stage where the actors were reciting lines she had long since forgotten. The halls were too bright, the laughter in the corridors was too shrill, and the constant, thrumming presence of people felt like a violation of the sacred, heavy silence she had shared with Draco in the dark. It had been 7 days since they emerged from the West Wing. 7 days of existing in a state of agonizing dual reality. In the eyes of the school, Hermione Granger was the diligent head girl, recovering from a minor magical accident. In the eyes of Draco Malfoy, she was a stranger. The emotional seesaw had swung into a brutal state of repulsion. At breakfast, she would watch him from across the hall, pale, distant, and perfectly composed. He never looked at her. When their paths crossed in the moving staircases, he would pull his robes tighter to avoid even the slightest brush of fabric, his eyes fixed on some point on the horizon as if she were made of glass. But the silence was a lie. Hermione could feel the static under her skin. Every time he was in the same room, her magic flared, a sympathetic vibration that made the tips of her fingers tingle with warmth. The Drakosis had left them synchronized, a lingering magical echo that tethered their nervous systems together. "Hermione, you're doing it again," Ginny whispered, leaning in close during their transfiguration study session. "You're staring at the door. You've been staring at it for 10 minutes. I'm just waiting for the light to change, Hermione lied, her voice sounding brittle. She looked down at her parchment, but the ink seemed to swirl into the shape of a silver basin. The internal conflict was a slow-moving storm. She felt a profound need to speak to him, to confirm that the kiss on the astronomy tower wasn't a hallucination born of exhaustion. But his public coldness was a wall she didn't know how to climb. Was he protecting her, as he claimed? Or was he retreating into the safety of his old prejudices, now that the threat of death was gone? That night, the restlessness became unbearable. The Gryffindor common room, with its roaring fire and cozy armchairs, felt like a cage. She needed the dark. She needed the cold. She made her way to the library, her footsteps echoing in the deserted corridors. She didn't have her invisibility cloak, but she moved with the practiced stealth of a war veteran. She found herself in the restricted section, near the back where the shadows were deepest. She wasn't alone. Draco was standing by a window, the moonlight catching the sharp, tragic line of his profile. He wasn't reading. He was just standing there, his hand resting on a shelf of old, leather-bound books. When she stepped into the light, he didn't jump. He let out a long, shuddering breath. "You're late, Granger," he murmured, his voice a low, rough rasp that sent a jolt of electricity down her spine. "I didn't know we had an appointment," she whispered, stepping closer. The tension between them was instantaneous, a thick, magnetic pull that made the air feel heavy. He finally turned to look at her. The mask of the Ice Prince was gone, replaced by the raw, emotionally broken boy from the chamber. His eyes were dark, haunted by the same memories that plagued her. "We don't," he said, stepping into her space. He stopped just inches away, the heat from his body radiating toward her. "But my magic won't stop screaming until I'm near you. It's been a week of torture." "Then why do you look at me like I'm a plague?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and longing. "Why do you walk past me as if you didn't say those things?" Draco's hand twitched, reaching toward her face before he caught himself and balled it into a fist at his side. The trust to betrayal swing was in full effect. He looked at her with such intense conflict that it felt like a physical weight. "Because the moment I acknowledge you, I sign your death warrant," he hissed. "Do you think the Carrows were the only ones who hated your blood? The world outside these walls is still full of people who want to see the Malfoy name restored. If they see me with you, they won't come for me. They'll come for the thing I value most. I am not a thing to be protected, Draco. I am a woman who survived a war. And I am a man who lost one," he roared softly, the sound muffled by the heavy books. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip desperate and shaking. "Don't you understand? In that room, I was free. I was just a soul. But out here, I am a Malfoy. I am a brand. I am the shadow that will darken your light until there's nothing left." He let go of her as if he had been burned, backing away into the shadows. The cold returned, sudden and sharp. He looked at her with a look of profound shame, his eyes darting to the floor. "You should go," he said, his voice flat. "This was a mistake." "It wasn't a mistake," Hermione said, her voice steady and hard. She stepped forward, closing the gap he had tried to create. She reached out and took his hand, forcing her fingers between his. The contact was explosive, a rush of warmth that made the shadows in the room seem to recede. The Drakosis didn't create these feelings, Draco. It just stopped us from lying about them. Draco looked down at their joined hands, his expression crumbling. He let out a choked, wet sound, a half sob, half laugh. He pulled her toward him, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He didn't kiss her. He just held her, his body trembling with the force of his suppressed emotions. The non-verbal intimacy was overwhelming. He smelled of sandalwood and the sharp metallic tang of the winter air. "I can't stand it," he whispered into her skin. "I can't stand being away from you, and I can't stand being near you. I'm drowning, Hermione." "Then let me be the anchor," she replied, her hands finding the small of his back. They stood there for a long time, two broken figures in a sea of forgotten knowledge. The slow burn of their relationship had moved past the point of simple attraction. It was now a matter of spiritual survival. But as the clock in the distance struck midnight, the peace was shattered. A soft, scraping sound echoed from the other end of the library. A footstep. Draco stiffened, his eyes snapping to the dark entrance of the aisle. He pushed Hermione behind him, his wand sliding into his hand with practiced ease. The tension shifted from romantic to lethal. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice regaining its cold, dangerous edge. There was no answer, only the sound of a retreating step and the soft flutter of a cloak. Draco looked back at Hermione, his face pale. Someone was watching. "Was it Filch?" she whispered, her heart hammering. "No," Draco said, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the floor. He knelt down and picked up a small, shimmering object that had been dropped in the rush. It was a small silver snake pin, a Slytherin crest, but with a dark, jagged line carved through its center. "The purebloods," he whispered, his voice trembling with a new kind of fear. "They know." He looked at the pin, then back at Hermione. The doubt returned, more terrifying than ever. The secret they had forged in the dark was no longer theirs alone. The game of survival hadn't ended when they left the West Wing. It had only just begun to claim its first victims. "Go," he commanded, his eyes filled with a desperate urgency. "Now, Hermione, don't look back." He pushed the pin into his pocket and vanished into the stacks before she could respond. Hermione stood alone in the dark, the cold air of the library chilling her to the bone. She looked at her empty hand, still feeling the ghost of his warmth. She walked back to her dormitory, her mind racing. The anonymous threat, the hidden eyes, the weight of a love that was also a target. As she lay in bed, staring at the canopy of her four-poster, she realized that the wait was over. The world was coming for them, and the only way to survive was to stop hiding. But as she closed her eyes, she saw the silver snake with a jagged line. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. The chapter ended with the feeling of a predator closing in. The "I need to know what's next" was no longer a curiosity. It was a heartbeat. The atmosphere at Hogwarts had shifted from the heavy, stagnant silence of the archive to a sharp, brittle tension that felt like walking on thin ice. For Hermione, the days following the incident in the library were a blur of hypervigilance. Every whisper in the great hall felt like a directed barb. Every shadow in the corridors seemed to hold a pair of watching eyes. The silver snake pin with the jagged scar, the mark of the purists, a radicalized faction of Slytherins who saw Draco's softness as the ultimate betrayal, haunted her thoughts. The emotional seesaw had tipped into a state of approach to repulsion that was no longer about their own feelings, but about the physical danger of their proximity. In the corridors, Draco was more than just cold. He was a ghost. He moved with a predatory speed, his eyes never lingering on her for more than a fraction of a second. But in those micro moments, Hermione saw the emotionally broken reality he was hiding. He wasn't just ignoring her to save himself. He was starving himself of her presence to keep her alive. It was a noble, agonizing form of self-torture that Hermione found herself resenting, even as she understood it. "He's going to break, Hermione," Ginny remarked one afternoon as they sat by the Black Lake. The wind was whipping Ginny's red hair across her face. "Malfoy. I saw him in the courtyard. Pansy was screaming at him about family honor, and he just stood there like a stone. He didn't even blink. People who don't blink are usually waiting for something to explode." "He's trying to protect everyone," Hermione whispered, her fingers digging into the cold grass. "But he's doing it by disappearing." The internal monologue in Hermione's head was a chaotic loop of logic and longing. "If he pushes me away, he's safe. If I pull him back, we both burn. But if we do nothing, the Drakosis won." The room had taught them that survival required truth. How could they survive in a world built on the lie of their mutual hatred? That evening, the conflict reached its breaking point. Hermione was returning from a late session with Professor McGonagall when she was cornered in a narrow passage near the potions dungeon. It wasn't Filch or a teacher. It was 3 Slytherin 7th years, led by Blaise Zabini. But this wasn't the Blaise she knew from a distance, the cool, detached observer. His face was set in a mask of rigid traditionalist fury. "Granger," Zabini said, his voice like silk over a blade. "We've been wondering when you'd finally realize that some doors are meant to stay shut." "I don't know what you're talking about, Blaise," she said, her hand moving toward her wand. "Don't. You're fast, but you're outnumbered. We're not here to fight. We're here to offer a warning. Draco is a Malfoy. He's a piece of a larger puzzle. You are an anomaly, a glitch in the system. The Drakosis didn't fix him. It poisoned him. He's forgotten who he belongs to." "He belongs to himself," Hermione snapped, her eyes flashing. "Does he?" Zabini stepped closer, the tension skyrocketing. "He's been acting like a martyr, thinking he can shield you. But if he doesn't return to the fold, if he doesn't stop this pathetic charade of waiting for a mudblood, we will make sure his mother's house arrest becomes a permanent cell." The threat hit Hermione like a physical blow. The trust to betrayal/doubt cycle swung violently. Had Draco known this? Was his distance a result of a direct threat to Narcissa? The realization that his coldness was a shield for his mother made Hermione's heart ache with a devastating protective warmth. "Get out of my way," she whispered, her magic flaring. The air in the corridor began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that made the torches flicker. Zabini smiled, a cold, empty thing. "We're leaving. But remember, every time you look at him, you're tightening the noose around his family's neck." They vanished into the shadows of the dungeons. Hermione stood trembling, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps. She needed to find him. She didn't care about the rules, the scripts, or the purists. She needed to see the silver in his eyes. She found him in the owlery. He was standing by the open window, his back to the door, watching a great horned owl fly into the distance. The air was freezing, smelling of wet feathers and the incoming snow. "They threatened your mother," she said, her voice cutting through the silence of the room. Draco didn't turn. His shoulders slumped, the weight of the mountain finally crushing him. "I know. Why didn't you tell me?" She walked toward him, her footsteps soft on the straw-covered floor. "You let me think you were just retreating. You let me doubt you." He turned then, and the sight of him made her stop. He looked shattered. The non-verbal intimacy of his grief was palpable. He reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered near her shoulder before dropping it back to his side. "Because if I told you, you'd do exactly what you're doing now," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You'd try to save me, and I can't let you do that, Hermione. I'm not worth the cost of your soul." "Don't you dare decide what I'm worth," she yelled, stepping into his space. The warmth of her fury was the only thing keeping the cold at bay. She grabbed the lapels of his robes, forcing him to look at her. "We survived the Drakosis. We survived a war. Do you really think I'm afraid of Blaise Zabini and a group of bigots?" "It's not just them," he groaned, his hands finally finding her waist, pulling her flush against him. It wasn't a romantic embrace. It was a desperate, drowning clutch. "It's the world. It's the history. It's the fact that no matter how much I love you, I will always be the boy who stood by while you were tortured." "No," she said, her forehead resting against his. "You are the man who shielded me in the dark. You are the man who chose mine over them. Look at me, Draco." He looked. The grey was filled with a raw, emotionally broken longing. The tense dialogue died away, replaced by the heavy, suffocating silence of the night. "I can't lose you," he breathed, "but I can't keep you." "Then let's stop waiting," she whispered. She pulled him down, and their lips met in a kiss that was a declaration of war. It was the approach in its purest form, raw, desperate, and filled with a terrifying magnetic pull. He kissed her with a hunger that spoke of weeks of starvation, his hands tangling in her hair as if he could hold on to the very essence of her. The slow burn had reached its flashpoint. In the freezing owlery, surrounded by the rustle of feathers and the smell of the coming storm, they weren't Gryffindor or Slytherin. They were just two people who had refused to die in the dark. But the repulsion was waiting. As they broke apart, breathless and shivering, a cold voice spoke from the doorway. Touching. Truly. They spun around. It wasn't Zabini. It was Theodore Nott, holding a small glowing crystal, a recording gem. "The headmistress will find this very interesting," Nott said, his eyes gleaming with a cruel triumph. "And the Daily Prophet will find it even better. The heroine and the Death Eater, a forbidden tryst. Your reputation is gone, Granger. And Malfoy, your mother is going to have a very long winter." Draco lunged for him, but Nott was already backing into the darkness of the stairs. "Don't bother, Draco. It's already been sent. The magic of the gem is linked." The silence that followed was the heaviest of all. Draco looked at Hermione, his face a mask of absolute horror. The doubt was gone, replaced by a devastating certainty. He had tried to protect her, and he had failed. "I told you," he whispered, his voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance. "I told." The chapter ended with the sound of the wind howling through the open windows and the feeling of a world finally collapsing in on them. The "I need to know what's next" was no longer a question of love, but a question of total, irrevocable destruction. The silence that followed the snap of Theodore Knott's recording gem was not the tranquil stillness of the Drakosis. It was the hollow, airless vacuum of a tomb. Hermione stood paralyzed, the taste of Draco's kiss still lingering on her lips, while the world she had fought so hard to rebuild crumbled beneath her feet. The wind in the owlery shrieked through the open rafters, mocking the warmth that had flourished between them only seconds before. Draco's hands, which had been clutching her with such desperate intensity, slowly slid away. His face transitioned from the raw heat of passion to a pallor so ghastly it was as if his blood had turned to lead. The repulsion was no longer a choice. It was a physical manifestation of his guilt. "It's over," he whispered, his voice a dead thing. He wasn't looking at the door where Nott had vanished. He was looking at Hermione's hands, as if he expected to see them blackened by the mere contact with his skin. "No," Hermione said, though her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "We can stop him. We can go to McGonagall first. We can explain—" "Explain what, Hermione?" Draco's laugh was a jagged, ugly sound that tore through the night. He turned toward the open window, the moonlight catching the silver of his eyes, now clouded with a terrifying absolute defeat. "Explain that the war heroine is in love with the boy who pointed the way for her killers. Explain that you've spent your nights in the shadows with a Death Eater. The Prophet won't care about the Drakosis. They won't care about waiting. They will see a girl who was confounded and a Malfoy who is back to his old tricks. They will destroy you to feel safe again." The internal conflict in Hermione's chest was a war between her logic and her soul. Her mind screamed that he was right. The public was fickle, the ministry was paranoid, and the purists were ruthless. But her soul, still tethered to his by the lingering threads of the anomaly, refused to let go. "I don't care about the Prophet," she said, her voice strengthening. She stepped toward him, but he retreated, his back hitting the stone wall of the tower. "I care," he roared, his mask finally shattering into 1,000 emotionally broken pieces. "I have nothing left, Hermione. My name is a curse, my home is a prison, and my future is a void. But you were supposed to be the one who got out. You were the only good thing left in this rotting castle, and I've dragged you into the mud with me." The warmth to cold shift was devastating. He looked at her with such profound self-loathing that it felt like a physical barrier between them. The tense dialogue was no longer a game of wits. It was a struggle for the very air they breathed. "You didn't drag me anywhere," she whispered, her eyes burning with tears. "I walked into the dark because I chose to, because I love you, Draco, and love isn't a glitch in the system." "It's a death sentence," he replied. He moved then, not toward her, but toward the exit. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated, as if he were a puppet with cut strings. He stopped at the threshold, his hand gripping the cold stone. He didn't look back. "Don't follow me. If you're seen with me tonight, there's no turning back. Go to the common room. Tell them I ambushed you. Tell them whatever you need to stay in the light." He vanished down the spiral stairs, the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. Hermione stood alone in the freezing owlery, her breath blooming in the air like ghosts. She felt the seesaw tilt into a vertical drop, trust to betrayal/doubt. Had he just given up? Was he abandoning her to save his own conscience, or was this his final desperate act of protection? The hours that followed were a blur of cold corridors and frantic thoughts. She didn't go to the common room. She went to the great hall, which was empty and vast, the enchanted ceiling reflecting a storm that hadn't yet broken. She sat at the Gryffindor table, the same place she had sat after the Drakosis, and waited. She was waiting for the explosion. It came at dawn. The great hall began to fill with students, the morning air heavy with the scent of toast and the rustle of newspapers. But today, the owls didn't just bring letters. They brought the Daily Prophet with a front-page headline that felt like a physical blow. The Heroine's Fall, Granger's Forbidden Alliance with Malfoy Heir. The picture was grainy but unmistakable. The recording gem had captured the moment in the library, the way their hands had interlocked, the way Draco had looked at her with a vulnerability that the prophet described as unnatural influence. The silence that fell over the hall was deafening. Thousands of eyes turned toward Hermione. She felt the repulsion of her peers, a wave of shock, disappointment, and sudden, sharp hostility. "Hermione!" Ron's voice was a mere thread of sound. He was holding the paper, his face drained of color. "Tell me this is a joke. Tell me he used a curse on you." Hermione looked at him, then at Harry, whose expression was a mask of unreadable stone. Then she looked at the Slytherin table. Draco was there. He was sitting perfectly straight, his face an impenetrable mask of aristocratic disdain. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at his empty plate, his hands folded in his lap. But his magic, she could feel it. It was a jagged, screaming thing, reaching out for her across the gap of the hall. "It's not a curse, Ron," she said, her voice echoing in the sudden quiet. The outrage was instantaneous. The whispers turned into roars. People stood up, pointing, shouting. But through the chaos, Hermione kept her eyes on Draco. He finally looked up. The non-verbal intimacy of that look was the only thing that kept her standing. It was a look of absolute, soul-crushing apology. "I'm sorry. I told you. I'm sorry." But then something shifted. Blaise Zabini stood up, a smirk on his face. He looked at the head table, where McGonagall was standing, her face pale with fury and shock. "It seems the game of survival has a new set of rules," Zabini called out, his voice cutting through the noise. "If the Ministry won't clean up the mess of the war, perhaps the students should." The purists at the Slytherin table stood as one. The tension between "can't stand it" and "can't help but think" had finally exploded into a physical threat. Draco stood up then, his chair screeching against the stone. He didn't look at Zabini. He looked at Hermione. For the first time, he didn't hide. He didn't retreat. He stepped away from his table, walking into the center of the hall, the neutral ground between the houses. "Leave her alone," he said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. "Or what, Draco?" Nott sneered, stepping forward. "You're a traitor to your blood. You're nothing." "I am a Malfoy," Draco said, his voice regaining a terrifying quiet power. "And I am the one who survived the Drakosis. I have seen the dark, and I have seen the truth. If you want to get to her, you go through me." The approach was complete. He had chosen. He had stepped out of the shadows and into the fire, knowing it would burn everything he had left. Hermione stood up, her heart leaping into her throat. She walked toward him, ignoring the shouts of her own house, ignoring the betrayal in Ron's eyes. She met Draco in the center of the hall, the place where the light was brightest. She took his hand. The warmth that flooded through them was enough to stop the world. The slow burn had ended, and the final shift had begun. They were no longer victims of a room or a war. They were the architects of their own destruction or their own salvation. Together, he whispered, his fingers tightening around hers. Together, she replied. The hall erupted into chaos as the first spell was cast, but as the light flared around them, Hermione felt a strange, defiant peace. The game was over. The secret was out. And as the world rushed in to tear them apart, she realized that the only way to survive was to finally, truly stop waiting. The chapter ended with the image of their joined hands amidst the swirling magic of a school at war with itself. The "I need to know what's next" was no longer about a romance novel. It was about the beginning of a revolution.
Thank you for staying with me until the end. This story is about more than magic. It is about two people in a dark room. They had many reasons to hate each other. They had scars from a long war, but in the dark they found the truth. Sometimes we build walls to stay safe. We call people enemies because it's easy. But Draco and Hermione learned a hard lesson. They learned that survivors need truth. They learned that love can grow in the coldest places. I hope this story touched your heart. Maybe it reminded you to look past the masks people wear. True magic happens when we finally stop fighting. True magic happens when we just wait for the heart to speak. Thank you for listening. See you in the next story.